All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we are laying the absolute bedrock for everything you're going to learn about the human mind. If you're just starting your journey into psychology, you're stepping into a field that tackles some of the most profound questions of our existence. I mean, who are we? What actually produces our thoughts, our feelings, our actions? And how do we even begin to understand the people around us? So today, we're focusing on day one. We're going to define what this discipline actually is, break down some of the biggest myths surrounding it, and then trace its incredible evolution from ancient philosophy into a rigorous modern laboratory science.
We've got a pretty clear roadmap for today. We'll start by asking what psychology is, then move into busting popular myths, trace the journey from philosophy to science, check out Wundt and the very first lab, and finish up with the epic debate of structuralism versus functionalism.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1. What exactly is psychology?
I want to ask you this directly right off the bat, because we need to immediately shatter the biggest preconceived notion out there. If you tell someone you're studying psychology, they often get a little defensive, right? They kind of think you're suddenly analyzing their every move, or that you've developed some sort of psychic ability to peer into their soul and read their deepest, darkest secrets. But is that what this field is actually about?
Well, spoiler alert, not quite. The word psychology originates from the Greek words psyche, which means life or soul, and logos, meaning explanation or study. And today, the formal definition is literally just the scientific study of mind and behavior. The absolute key takeaway here is that psychologists aren't psychic. Rather, they are rigorously observing the connections between your life, your thoughts, and your actions. They just want to know why people think the things they think and why they do the things they do.
Notice how this brilliantly divides our definition into two distinct halves. We have the external actions we can clearly see versus the internal experiences we have to systematically infer. Behavior is anything an organism does that we can actually observe and record, whether that's screaming, crying, or, playing a wicked air saxophone to an imaginary audience. Mental processes, on the flip side, are the internal subjective experiences we have while we're tearing it up on those invisible instruments: our sensations, our dreams, our thoughts, and our feelings.
Moving right along to Section 2, let's tackle pop culture versus reality by busting some popular psychology myths. Look, if you're picturing Sigmund Freud chewing a cigar while analyzing your dreams as you casually recline on a leather couch, you are looking at a pop culture myth. That is not the vast empirical reality of most modern researchers. Now, yes, clinical therapy is incredibly important, but psychology is actually a massively diverse science. Most psychologists are out working in research labs, hospitals, and field settings. They use objective observations and hard empirical data to understand everything from how birds recognize each other all the way to the factors that lead to human aggression. It's a real empirical science, not just folksy common sense.
And speaking of common sense, it turns out our intuition is deeply flawed. Have you ever experienced hindsight bias? It's that classic, I knew it all along phenomenon. Once we learn the outcome of a situation, our brains completely trick us into thinking we could have predicted it from the start. Because our gut feelings so easily invent explanations after things happen, we absolutely cannot rely on common sense to scientifically explain human behavior.
So, to fix that flawed intuition, we obviously need a solution, and that means applying the scientific method step by step to separate verified human tendencies from mere folklore. We've got to start by acknowledging our own mental blind spots and then lean heavily on objective observation and rigorous experimentation. Literally, this is the only way to establish true empirical cause and effect relationships, rather than just relying on what feels right in the moment.
Which perfectly leads us to Section 3. From philosophy to science, where we trace the discipline's evolution.
This timeline beautifully compresses over 2,000 years of history. It shows us how abstract philosophical debates about the human mind slowly accelerated into a measurable, hard discipline. Back in ancient Greece around 400 BCE, you had Socrates and Plato basically deriving principles by pure logic, arguing that knowledge is innate. But Plato's student Aristotle had a profound love of data. He argued that knowledge actually grows from the experiences stored in our memories. Jump ahead to the 1600s, and you've got thinkers like René Descartes dissecting animals to find out how the mind and body communicate, while British thinkers were taking a much more down-to-earth approach, centered on experiment and actual experience.
A massive turning point in this history was John Locke's argument that we are born as blank slates. This set the stage for empiricism and the absolute need to observe the world to understand it. Locke famously argued that the human mind at birth is a tabula rasa, literally a blank slate upon which experience writes. This view firmly established empiricism, which is the idea that knowledge comes strictly from experience.
Basically, if we want to do science, we must rely on observation and experimentation, not just sit around in an armchair reasoning about the world. Okay, let's dive into the exact moment psychology officially became a science in Section 4, Wundt and the First Lab.
This right here is ground zero for modern psychology. This is where Wilhelm Wundt pulled the study of the mind out of the philosopher's armchair and put it squarely onto the laboratory table. In December of 1879, at the University of Leipzig in Germany, Wundt, who was a physician, established the very first formal laboratory dedicated strictly to psychological research. This was the monumental moment the field shifted from theoretical speculation into an empirical, lab-based science.
Now, what made Wundt's approach so revolutionary was that he wasn't just theorizing anymore. He was actively measuring the physical reaction time it took to process an auditory sensation. His classic apparatus was incredibly simple, but totally groundbreaking. He meticulously measured the exact time lag between a person hearing a ball hit a platform and their physical reaction of pressing a telegraph key. I absolutely love this quote from him because it brilliantly illustrates his ambition. He literally wanted to measure the atoms of the mind. By isolating the fastest and simplest mental processes, Wundt was essentially trying to find the fundamental building blocks of human consciousness, much like a physicist breaking down matter. With the science officially born, let's move to our final section and examine the first great debate, structuralism versus functionalism.
To really understand the battle between these first two major schools of thought, ask yourself if it's more important to examine the physical parts of a structure or the actual purpose it serves. Imagine a house. Do you study the individual bricks, the wood, the specific layout of the rooms? Or do you study the fact that the house provides shelter, warmth, and a place to adapt to the weather outside?
See how clearly this breaks down the battle lines? You have Edward Titchener's desire to break the mind into simple elements, up against William James's focus on why our behaviors evolved to help us survive. Titchener, who was a student of Wundt, championed structuralism. He took his cues from chemistry, thinking, hey, if they can break matter down into simple elements, I can do the exact same thing for the brain. On the flip side, you have the American physician and philosopher William James, championing functionalism. Heavily inspired by Charles Darwin, James didn't care as much about the individual bricks. He wanted to know the function of behavior. Why do we think, feel, and smell the way we do? And how are those adaptive behaviors conserved throughout evolution to keep us alive?
Ultimately, structuralism fell apart because it relied on patients subjectively reporting their inner feelings about things like a sunset or, licking a kitten. This made way for James's more practical, evolutionary focus on the function of behavior. Think about it. Titchener relied on a method called introspection, asking people to look inward and report their exact sensations when doing something random. The problem is, introspection is inherently subjective. Your internal experience of a kitten might be wildly different from mine. Because we can't objectively observe a patient's inner thoughts, structuralism faded pretty quickly. Functionalism's strength, however, its focus on observable, adaptive behavior, laid a much stronger foundation for the incredibly diverse, integrated science we have today.
So we've debunked the myths and traced the empirical history, but as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a challenge for your journey ahead. You now know that psychology isn't mind reading or just armchair philosophy. It is the rigorous empirical study of why we do what we do. Excluding other human minds, your mind is the most complicated piece of the universe that humanity currently knows about. So now that you know the foundation, are you ready to critically examine your own thoughts and behaviors? Because that is exactly what this science empowers you to do.